Okay, welcome everyone to our Next Gen Talks, the Future of Policing video podcast series. This is coming to you from the National Gen Z and Millennial community. Our conversation today is called, Is the Struggle Real? The Black Cop Perspective, and we're going to dive in and allow officers to really give us their view on being law enforcement officials, their learnings, their struggles, and their story and their take on how policing can improve in America. My name is Mya Jacobs, and I am a part of the National Millennial Gen Z community. I'm going to be your conversation host today, and I am from New Orleans. Well, I'm in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I've graduated from Xavier University of Louisiana, and I'm now working in marketing and public relations. We have two really great guests today, so I'm going to introduce them, give a short bio, and allow them to, wave and smile and be awesome for the camera. Today, I'm here with Domino Scott-Jackson, who is a police officer in the Pasadena Police Department in California, and she's also an instructor of implicit bias courses for other police departments in the region. So, hi, Domino.
Hi.
And I'm also here with Booker Hodges. He is the Assistant Commissioner of the Minnesota State Department of Public Safety and a former president of the Minneapolis NAACP chapter.
Hey,
Booker. So today we're here to have a conversation about the Black cop perspective. So what does that mean? We think it's really important when we talk about the future policing to bring in representatives of not only the Black community, but also law enforcement community and hear from them in a very unique way. What Black officers offer to this conversation of how do we have better and safer communities? What have they seen in their rise and in their careers that for both of them are spanning over a decade? And how can we take their experiences, take their learnings, take their understandings, and create a public understanding of what solutions we need to make sure that everyone feels safe, especially our minority and POC communities? So with that, I guess I'm going to start off with a question that I think is staring us all in the face. Is the struggle real? And anybody can pick that one up for me.
I'm a gentleman, so seriously, I always do defer to ladies first.
He's putting you on the spot.
And I'm not trying to dodge. I promise I'll answer your question.
Pretty much putting me on the spot. So with that, I mean, I would say that question is pretty complicated, to be honest with you. And I think that, maybe you can provide a little bit more with that question or what it is that you're maybe referring to specifically as far as that question.
Okay, awesome. So with that question, when we were developing our episode titles, we kept coming around to this conflict or maybe even this tension between being a Black person and being an officer. And I guess with Is the Struggle Real, we are coming in with kind of this assumption. Do you kind of go through a specific struggle or specific difficulties with the fact that you are an African-American woman in your case and in law enforcement?
So honestly, for me, I mean, I grew up in law enforcement. I mean, most of my adult time has been working here at the police department. And so I don't really feel that necessarily that I mean, there's different struggles, but I mean, I don't feel that the struggle would be necessarily different because I'm a Black female in this profession. So I think there's different struggles, but and challenges that we as women in this profession have to deal with, but not for me specifically as far as being a female and being a Black female in this profession.
Okay, I definitely understand that. I think with the cross section of identities, especially me coming as a Black woman, sometimes I'm like, is this a Black thing or is this just I'm a woman in society thing? So when you said that, it really resonated with me. I'm like, yeah, sometimes I just think even if I was maybe perhaps a Black male, some things would be easier sometimes. So going over to our Black male, Officer Booker, how do you?
So And I think this, first I want to thank you, Mya, for doing this. It's really important for your generation. I know I might not look that old, but you could really see this is like gray. So, I'm not as young as the face might appear to be, but
it's a little salt and peppery. I see.
But seriously, I'm really glad that you all are doing this. And I think, when you bring people on and people have different perspectives, and I think one thing that we often do with Black people specifically, and this is what I'm going to talk about, is we assume that everybody has the same type of experiences, right? And I think one thing you see is that people don't. Now, if you ask me, I'm going to tell you that, yes, the struggle is real, right? And I'm coming to you from being the second highest ranking cop in the state of Minnesota, and I'm telling you that the struggle is real just based on my experience. Now, I personally believe that as a society, the one issue that we have yet to deal with is the issue of racism, specifically with the African-American descendant of the slave community. And what I mean by that is if you look throughout history in this country, every time somebody comes to a new movement, it always comes back to trying to mimic or trying to attach themselves to the struggle that the African-American community has had. And I am not mad at those folks at all, but I think the one thing that we have never had in this country, specifically with the African-American communities, we've had assimilation, right? When we called the schools integrated, when in actuality there were more assimilation than integration, because a lot of the history that the way that African-American kids got taught wasn't taught in schools, right? And we've had cultural appropriation in a lot of cases, but we really haven't had full integration into American society for people, society really accepting African-Americans as African-Americans. And now you bring that into a police department. And those experiences can range from, people not having struggles to people having struggles. And I think it just all depends on where you're at. But that's something that I think the race issue specifically with the African-American community is something that this country just has not wanted to deal with in many respects.
Okay. And I feel that. So I guess bringing it back around to a Gen Z perspective, I think something that any millennial or Gen Z Black person might have experienced, especially when you talk about Black Lives Matter movement, which is something that really inspired this project, is running into other Black people and having to recognize that we don't all have the same experience. And that we often fight to say that, because like even within my own local high school, I show up, Black Lives Matter. I think it was like a spirit dress down day. And we came as the Black Panthers because last minute, we all got Black and some sunglasses. Let's do it. And then I'm having another conversation with the Black girl in my class, and she's like, all lives matter. And we're having this conversation because we have completely different perspectives because we grew up completely differently. So that's valid too. So I guess going into the next question and maybe pushing back on, is there a struggle being a Black officer? I think something that creates a struggle is the killing of an unarmed Black person. And the fact that we've been seeing that across the country, and it brings not only law enforcement into question, but also Black law enforcement when you get into the politics of the Black community feeling a certain entitlement to a certain reaction or certain protection. So I guess our next question is, if you take all the high profile, controversial police shootings involving unarmed Black people in the news for the last 5 years, do you think those officers were motivated by racism and bias, by poor training? Was it poor judgment in the moment, lack of compassion for human life? What is constituting these situations where we say, oh, that was a bad cop, that was a bad apple, that was a bad call, or maybe even the opposite, but we can't get to that because it's so racially charged, because we have a racially charged society?
Well, see, and I mean, I know what I say typically a lot of times doesn't fit the narrative for some of this stuff, but for me personally, 6,500 Black people get killed every year by other Black people. Police kill about 120. That's way too many. And I can tell you, unfortunately for me, I've had to call moms who lost their kids as a result of getting shot on the street. And I've had to call family members when one of my deputies had got involved in an officer-involved death situation. And they all cry the same. They all have the same type of trauma, and they all go into the same ground, unfortunately. And all these deaths are something that we really have to really value, because I value Black lives, period. And I mean, I know that there's so many Black people that are not here that should be here. But in terms of the police department, you ask if some of the stuff is motivated by race. And I know Ms. Domino teaches unconscious bias too. And one of the things when you teach unconscious bias is this thing that all humans have is a natural danger detector, right? And that danger detector makes decisions based on your background and your experience. And if you have a background and experience in where you may have a bias against a certain group of people, the minute that danger detector goes off before your conscious mind can even catch up, you've already made that decision. So in my opinion, and I'm not commenting on any incidents in Minnesota, because I'm in charge of the agency that does all the officer-involved shooting investigations. But in my opinion, in other instances outside of Minnesota, I have seen cases where I believe that that unconscious bias danger detector has went off and officers have taken actions. Sorry, I know it doesn't fit the narrative, but that's my answer.
I mean, what is a narrative? I don't think this conversation is about narrative. It's about real people, real stuff, because there is a narrative. There's a media narrative. There's a social media narrative. And that's why we're doing this, because we want to talk about what real people are saying. Like when I talk to my uncle, it's like a real person, a real police officer saying, you know what, this is the type of call I make based off of my training, off of what I got going on. So I appreciate that. Domino, did you want to follow up on that question?
Yeah, so I would say that, I think that it's extremely important to really recognize that, just as Booker mentioned, that, some of the things that, people tend to look at is relative to maybe their training or relative to some of the things, their experiences or lack of experiences. And with implicit bias, one of the things that we do talk about is exactly that, the danger, sixth sense, kind of that sixth sense, make, things that situations that might make, the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And that is also a safety mechanism as well. So, I mean, I think it's just important to see that with bias and implicit bias, sometimes our experiences may inhibit us or keep us from making certain decisions. And sometimes things are relative to your training and experience or lack thereof.
Okay. And so when I'm thinking about, your responses in this conversation, keeping that general public in mind and thinking about the fact that we're moving towards solutions, these are very solution-based responses. And I want to kind of create a way of funneling that to people who are hearing it with maybe more emotional ears, or just not to like scapegoat them as emotional, but just to kind of pierce the veil between how do we have solution-based responses where we talk about implicit bias training, we talk about danger sensors, and we talk about what's happening in the situation. And we're honestly describing it from the protocol of the person who's going to be in these situations. And we match that up to, oh, they were just racist. Like, just like that really common law way of just sticking to racist, like this is racist. And kind of when somebody hears implicit bias, maybe they're trying to think, does implicit bias equal anti-racism? Like, how is this eradicating what we feel like is racism coming into law enforcement and how that's affecting us as a general public?
So I think, for me, first and foremost, and I mean, obviously being a teacher of unconscious bias, I don't use the term implicit, it's just because it implies something, but that's a whole nother topic. But I think what people, really have to understand, and I think law enforcement has done a terrible job at this, is explaining to people that cops are human beings, right? And everything that comes along in society, if society says it's okay to yell at people, how do you think you're going to keep that fully out of a police department, right? I mean, it's one of these things where the society is the foundation of the police department, because ultimately all law enforcement officers come from the departments or come from the community. And my personal feeling is this: is I really believe, and I tell people this all the time. I go back to, we haven't really had integration. We've only had assimilation in this country. And the only way we're really going to change a lot of these police departments and some of these places is to have integration of community members, people who come from the community, who live and work in these departments. Not assimilation. What I mean by that is this: just because I'm a person of color and I get hired in a police department, am I going to stick with my social identity, or am I going to assimilate into the police culture, right? And I think that is the toughest decision for most officers. And I can just tell you my experience when I started in law enforcement. I was everybody's friend. I did narcotics, I did SWAT, but the minute I decided that I was climbing up the ranks, and the minute that as president of NAACP, I had to take a stand on some issues, all that changed. And I had a choice to make. And the choice was, am I going to assimilate, or am I going to stay me? And ultimately for me, the decision was to stay me, because when I take that badge and uniform off and when I retire, Booker's still going to be Booker.
Booker's still going to be Booker. Just to follow up, when you say you did narcotics, you worked in the narcotics division, you were like a officer, you were a detective?
Yeah, so I did, and again, not fitting the narrative, because in Minnesota, I worked gangs, and I focused on outlaw motorcycle gangs, because at the time, nobody wanted to investigate outlaw motorcycle gangs, because also outlaw motorcycle gangs are very notorious for having, big legal teams, and some members have legit jobs, and no one wanted to mess with them, and that was the route I decided to go.
And when you say like not fitting the narrative, what narrative aren't you fitting? Like, how are you being an outlaw officer and just not fitting something? What's this narrative?
I think the narrative in society, right, is that people tend to believe that, one, all Black people feel the same way, right? Two, the other narrative is that a lot of times when you do shows or whatever, people expect you to really focus on, a lot of the officer involved deaths regarding people of color, but not talk about the shootings, right? And all the death that takes place in the urban core. And for me, I always have to focus on the urban core, even though people sometimes don't want to hear it, because I've been shot at 5 times and none of them were as a police officer, right? Up here in Minnesota, where George Floyd was killed, we got an area, George Floyd, where the city put up barricades and built a memorial, and Black people are dying in that space every day. It's like an autonomous zone in the city of Minneapolis. I mean, there's even been snipers on the rooftops in this area. If someone gets shot in there, the cops don't go in. The people actually carry them out to meet the squads outside of this area. And that's what I mean by not fitting the narrative is, to me, we can't ignore that. I mean, God forbid, like I said, the 120 Black people that get killed by the cops every year, one is too many, right? But if we can focus on that 6,500 and reduce that 6,500, I think we can really start to lessen the police presence in our neighborhoods.
Okay, so I guess I'm gonna push back on that in a couple of ways. Got like a couple pinpoints, and I think I want Officer Domino's be on that too. So let's go to Officer Domino first. I just want to see what she has for that narrative.
So I wanted to kind of go back a little bit to what Booker said about, the really important piece is the community engagement and really getting out into the community within the police department and letting people in our communities that we serve see us as we're human beings. We have feelings and we have families and we have things that are important to us. And I think it's extremely important that the communities that we serve see us not just in uniform. And I think that's been one of the things that a lot of police departments have been trying to do for many, many, many years, of just integrating that, community engagement, bridging the gap between communities and their police departments with the different programs and different things that are offered. And then, to ensure that, to make sure that there's just a good understanding about that we're human too, and we have those emotions and we have different feelings as well. So, I think that's an extremely important piece of it, that we are out there and that the community does see us in a different light, other than in the police car or in uniform all the time. So that's a big piece of it.
I know you submitted them, but I actually need to say a lot.
And just to follow up, you feel like that's a big piece that's missing from the narrative. Like if there's a narrative, something that's missing from it is we're human too. And that's not just like us Black cops, that's all across the board for law enforcement. Is that safe to say?
Security card?
I'm sorry, what was the first part?
So how did I forget that fast? So, just following up that part about being human, that's part of that narrative that Booker was talking about,
Yes.
Like it's not the normal narrative, it's not what's a part of the narrative, but it's what it needs to be a part of the narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah, it needs both sides have to come together and really get to see, community has to see what we're feeling and what we're thinking and vice versa. So I think that should be, the narrative as we move forward in policing.
And what's the solution outcome of that? Because I guess, making sure we're staying on track with being very solution-based and walking away with tangible stuff. How do you think in that perspective, creating the humanization of officers when we're in this dialogue, in addition to implicit bias training and everything else we're probably going to get into in this call, what does that add to us as moving forward with better policing, better public safety, better communities, safer communities?
Well, I was kind of going to my history. I was fortunate enough to grew up here in Pasadena and come and work at this police department. And so bringing people within the community to work inside the police department is a big piece of it as well. I'll tell you, when I first started, I would see and deal with people or engage with people in the community that I would have went to elementary school with or, middle school with, and they remembered me from that. And sometimes just seeing that person or seeing someone that or that you've had a different positive encounter with, that they then see you, and then it's kind of like, oh yeah, I know who that person is, and this is what they did for me, or they helped me, or, and you can kind of fill in the blank, but that just goes right back to the community engagement and the solution. I think one of the solutions is to be more involved in the community and hire from the community. And that's a big piece of it too, is hiring and retaining. So retention is another big piece of it. But if we can hire people that live in this community, grow up in this community, they understand the dynamics of the community. Therefore, their response could potentially be a little bit different.
I appreciate that. And I think that's very true. I mean, coming from my perspective, having police officers in my family, I mean, I grew up, I was going to a daycare. My daycare lady, I call her Mama Cheryl. That's who that was. Her husband was a police officer. So I was seeing that badge. I was seeing that uniform day in and day out from like the age of 6. And then I had an aunt. She was a police officer. I have an uncle. He's a police officer. I call him to help him prep me on this. So it's just like, I think of police officers as a part of my community, as a part of my family. But I will say, just to push back on a little bit, it does not cut through a sense of fear that I get when I'm interacting with law enforcement in a Like, this isn't my kitchen. I'm driving and lights come up behind me. I'm like, ooh, like it's this unsettled feeling. So I guess that does kind of create some contention for me as far as how deep can the narrative work when we're not addressing the issues that are causing fear to override my entire life experience. Like that's something that's happening in a moment, in a second, random, not planned. And it overrides 22 years of experience living around law enforcement and seeing law enforcement and loving law enforcement, because those were my family members, well, I guess say loving people who are in law enforcement, to be more exact. And I think that brings me back to Booker, because he said something and it twinged me. And you're right. It is something that's in the normal narrative that I feel like is a back and forth with law enforcement and, the layman and the public when we bring up Black on Black violence, when it comes to police brutality, or maybe, I would say like the unarmed shooting of Black people or a Black person dying at the hands of police officers. And going back to solution-based and going back to what I commented as far as, those incidences are the reason why, no matter how much background I have in my family, how much prior experience I have that's positive with law enforcement, when lights come up behind me, I'm just thinking about these incidences. And I'm thinking about unfair treatment. And I'm thinking about what you said, which is one is too many out of 120. And I think I just want more of, I want to see the solution in linking together what's happening in communities with Black on Black violence. And if we're going to isolate it, it's like any race, it's that on that violence is going to be the highest in the category. White people kill more white people than Black people kill white people. Like that's just true across the board. So what solutions and what things are we addressing when we link them and we say we need to address this to address this? Can you like dive into that more?
So I can tell you for me, and I just got through speaking to a church group today, and I mean, I always bring this up, and I say, for the African American community, we have a choice right now. We're at a crossroads, and the crossroads is: do we want to continue the them and they, right? And I know you're a little younger, so all my friends growing up were always older. Even in law enforcement, they were older. So I'm gonna just explain the them and they and kind of how I see it, right? Growing up as a Black kid in the projects in the early 90s, I was a them and they, right? I mean, if you go watch how they debated the crime bill, it was politically correct to call me a thug. It was politically correct to call me a gang member. Everybody, used, video clips of, people who look like me dressed like Crips and Bloods to scare people. And what do we get out of that, right? The them and they used the 3 strikes you're outlaw, the reducing the amount of the age for juveniles to commit crimes, gang databases to document people like me. And my question, and now we're still trying 3 strikes you're out, right? I mean, so now we're trying to dig out of that, right? From when I was them and they, right? And the question we have to ask ourselves as a community is, do we want to put the police in the them and they category, right? And that's the crossroads, because, just like, I didn't gang bang, I didn't do any of that, right? But just merely by the simple color of my skin, and I'll never forget going into Target, and this lady who was a different color than me literally grabbed her purse, stuck it up under her arm, and I was 18 years old, and ran out of the store because she saw me, right? And I will never, and why, right? Because she was scared. She was legitimately, she was in fear of herself because she was taught that people like me were criminals. And I think that's where we're at. We got to decide, do we want to continue to them and they, or do we want to stop it? And I know it's hard for people. And I want to just talk about one more thing with you real quick. This notion of being scared when the police are behind you and turn on the lights. I have that, right? And I jokingly would tell people, I'd be in my squad car driving and I'd see another squad car and I'd slam on the brakes, right? And I'm gonna fully, and I did that when I
would shake your head like, yeah, like wait, and
I was a sergeant and I'm doing that, right? And all these people work for me and I'm still doing that, right? So, and If you talk to most cops have I shouldn't say fear, but they have most cops, when they're not working and they see that squad car, they're gonna slow down, right? Most cops, that butterflies that you get in your stomach, they're gonna have that too. I just think it's something natural in society that we do have. Now, most cops don't have the trauma that people in the community have, right? Which is one thing that we don't necessarily talk too much about, is that trauma of seeing these instances over and over and over again. And what happens with that is, you automatically, put yourself in that person's position because they look like you, and you just internalize it. And that's how we go. So just to close, and I know I ramble on a little bit, is that cops do too feel the same way you do when they see a squad car behind them.
And you're saying the solution is we got to just actively reach in and say, I can't do this. Like, I gotta kind of muscle myself and not make generalizations, not judge people, and basically not use the tools of the issue as like my reaction to the issue. Because
I know this, a lot of people sometimes, because as human beings, we naturally want to do the, let's get them, right? But when does this stop? That's my question. I mean, it didn't feel good, when people discriminated against me just simply based on the color of my skin. Why would I put another group in that? You know what I mean? Being a person of faith, I choose not to do that. But at the same time, I realize how hard it is for human beings not to do that, right? And that's, just kind of where I'm at. And I know that solution people don't want to hear, but nothing else has worked. I mean, we've been through where we've put different groups into them and they, and nothing else has worked up until this point.
Officer Domino, how you feel about that?
Just to kind of go back, I was chuckling earlier about, the police car behind me when I'm off. Yeah, I mean, it happens to all of us. And I cannot say that there's one police officer that I know that doesn't kind of get that, like butterflies, like, oh my gosh, like, what did I do? Or, what happened? But then what that speaks to is the human side of it. So that just shows you, like, I think that we get lost in that as a law enforcement community. We get lost in the fact that, like, seen as, not saying that we're seen as not human, but I think it's forgotten that, sometimes, the decisions that we have to make are the decisions we have to make, in response to what's, presented to us at that particular time based on training and experience. But at the end of the day, there's still that human side of it, and I think the only way that we're going to, as we talk about solutions, I think the only way that we're going to get better is we have to continue to do it. We have to continue to work at it. We can't just say, here's this program, here's this, resource, and then just be done with it. It's got to be something that's continual. And it's got to be, inclusive. Both sides have to come to the table, with moving forward to have a clear understanding of, both perspectives.
To clarify, both sides, it's like law enforcement, public.
Yes.
And figuring out where we intersect in that, but also recognizing that it is unfortunately kind of a silo because there is one and then there's the other, in a sense. I really like how you said that because it triggered a question that I had for Booker based off of what he said about his journey of rising through the ranks. And I kind of want to give this to both of y'all, but I'll start with maybe like more of a case study. So, we all just had this winter freeze that happened that, like, I know you didn't care about in Minnesota. You were like, what? Y'all were a man up, but no, it was too much. I'm from the South. It was too much. She's in California. It was too much.
And we don't have winters here.
Right. And my uncle, when I was like prepping with him, he told me about a situation where it just kind of realigned this kind of moral, social, this is who I am identity with this is law enforcement and we have laws. And it was kind of like the difference between a moral call and a lawful call. So there was a man who was experiencing homelessness and he was sheltering at this abandoned business, but because it was a business, it was private property, somebody called the police on him. And when my uncle passed by, he talked to him, tried to like maybe get him a room. That didn't work out because everything was booked. And he just said, look, I'm gonna pass by again. I'm gonna try to check on you, X, Y, Z, and the other. And he kind of left it be. Somebody came up after him and they wrote him a ticket because the law was, okay, you're trespassing, you're on private property. And it was a lawful call. And specifically, it was a call that was over my uncle's rank. So even though it didn't sit well with him, it was just kind of like, this is what it is. And just to get into a couple of things, do you feel like, especially as a Black cop, you just have like these constraints with, this is the law, this is the culture, but that's just not sitting well with me. Like, I just don't like this call. I don't like what has to get done. And does that create a struggle for you on your day to day?
So speaking of the homeless call that you talked about, I worked our homeless outreach team here in the city for close to 5 years. So yeah, I mean, there is, somewhat of a challenge and recognizing, hey, this is, as we would say, the letter of the law. And then, the spirit of the law. Letter of the law is, hey, I'm going to do it because I can, right? Because the law is telling me I can do this. And then the spirit of the law is more of like, I could do this, but what would be the repercussions, or what's the, what's going to be the end result? And so dealing with homelessness and crisis calls in particular, I think one of the big things is, for me, in dealing with that particular population, there were probably a lot of times where I was like, you know what, this person probably needs services more than they need a citation. And obviously this person may have gotten numerous citations and that's not working. So again, it's incumbent upon us as, law enforcement officers to try to get to the solution. And, sometimes the solution is not a quick fix, or it's not going to be a quick response. Specifically speaking to like homeless issues, which is one of the biggest things that law enforcement agencies are facing. So, I think that, and I'll be completely honest, I think that's something here in your heart, to make that decision, and which way if you have that option, let me say that, if you have the option to make that decision, then you have to make that decision and, and decide like, what, this is the right thing to do. So I'm going to do this. And then of course, there's going to be people that, you have to answer to if it's not maybe in line with what the next person would have done, or maybe what the sergeant would have wanted to have done. But, I think at the end of the day, it kind of comes back, for me personally, it comes back to here, like, how would I want if that were my family member, how would I want them to be treated? What options would I want them to be given in that particular situation?
Thank you. And Booker, I'm going to set you up because I know some things about you. You're an advocate of how law enforcement is not set up to deal with issues of social services. And you're even quoted saying, the question for society needs to be, do we want to bring the criminal justice system into these different avenues? Because like I said, in this case study, somebody called the police on them. So taking what you have, your standpoint on that, how do you feel about the situation and like that moral to the law, the letter of the law situation, as far as solutions for situations like this, when we feel like law enforcement is just being unhelpful in these kind of dire need situations?
And for me, it's all about character. When I hire, I always hire people who got character. And one of the first questions I ask is, do you volunteer? And if you don't volunteer, your application goes in the trash, right? And I'm not saying nothing again, I haven't said publicly, because here's the deal. If you don't volunteer, how do I know how you're going to take care of these people out there? The law is gray in many, many circumstances. And, that's always the way that I've viewed it. And, when you talk about, and I'm going to try to be short because this is probably like one of my most passionate issues, is I always say, police officers, we got this duty belt on, right? Every time we go somewhere, the tail of the criminal justice system goes with us. And I ask, why are we bringing the tail of the criminal justice system into places where it doesn't need to be, right? And I think as a society, we need to really start having that conversation, right? I was an SRO for 3 years at a level 4 special education school. And the kids would get into fights and the teachers would want the kids charged. I said, no, I'm not doing that. I mean, if no one's hurt, I'm not taking a report. I'm not doing any of that because I don't want these kids to be touched by the system, right? Because the system is not set up to help people. As much as we want to believe that it is, in many cases, it's not. There's nothing that the criminal justice system the criminal justice system was not designed to help people. And that's, and I know I'm not fitting the narrative, especially in law enforcement, when I say cops shouldn't respond to mental health calls. I just don't think we belong in those situations. I don't think we belong in a situation where the kid doesn't want a 13-year-old kid doesn't want to go to school and we're going to send a squad over there for that. I think we really need to start looking at, because at the end of the day, you have a police officer, he or her in Minnesota, we have to have a college degree, right? To be a police officer. That officer is bringing his or her life experience into a situation. And if that officer has a very narrow life experience, because a lot of agencies only hire background or people who have clean backgrounds and never done anything in their lives, right? Whereas me, I like people who make mistakes because I want to see how you reacted to those mistakes, right? Because the cops who've made mistakes before they were cops are some of the most non-judgmental police officers you are ever going to meet. But I'll leave it there.
I love that. And I really wanted to create some tension between you and Domino, because she is with HOPE, she's introducing, that background of doing more social work with law enforcement. But we're a little bit over, and if you guys have time, I really want to get your perspective, because you just mentioned something about how you're not going to hire somebody who doesn't, volunteer. And something that we really wanted to know is from the perspective of a Black officer, and taking into account some of the issues and some of the barriers of entry, and then some of the lack of barriers of entry when it comes to law enforcement. What skills, training, or screening should be implemented and or eliminated from the process of becoming an officer?
So you're asking what should be, what skills or what should be eliminated?
So I guess if we're going around the gambit, you can go all the way to screening when somebody's applying, down to police training. What are we overly training on? What are we under training on? What are we using to kick people out of the application pool, specifically Black and brown officers potentially? What are we not flagging when it's okay, this person is going to be, I'm going back to the Black people's sixth sense, which is common sense. This person is just not going to work well with other communities, X, Y, Z, and the other. What are some things in your experience you just feel aren't a part of the process when it comes to hiring and training, or are a part of the process and are actually just creating unnecessary barriers to us as a general public having better officers?
So I would say that the hiring process is pretty intensive and has a lot of different steps that I would say I think are important as you go through the steps. Booker had mentioned a really good point about hiring, is that there's a happy medium between the experience, life experience, and have experienced different things in your life, and how you bring that to the profession, and how you bring that. And that goes to just, working at, a place where you have to talk to people all the time, a customer service job like that. Those are important things that we look for. We look for interactions that you have with your family, and interactions that you have with your other coworkers. So, I mean, I think as far as the process, I think that, the things that are set in the process, and again, we're regulated. I think that's the other thing is we're regulated by POST, which is the Commission on Police Officer Standard Training, and so there's certain things that the state, basically requires that have to be accomplished. So as far as that piece of it, I mean, it's, we're kind of regulated, basically, is a good way to put it. As far as the training piece, I think that, like I was saying earlier about the continual training, the constant continual training, has to be part of the agenda, to come in and teach one implicit bias training class, twice once a year, once every other year. I don't think there's a benefit in that. I think it's important to have those conversations, to share those experiences, and have those training classes on, diversity, de-escalation, implicit bias, but on a continual basis, not just once every couple of years or, more continual.
Awesome. Booker?
So there's a couple things. So first I'll just talk about, Minnesota, we do have POST too, which, has disqualifiers. So I will just say that, for applicants who have the disqualifiers, which are basically like a federal or, felony conviction and whatnot, there's nothing we can do with that. But the hurdles that I've removed from every single hiring process once I got there was credit, right? Credit used in a hiring decision, right? It makes absolutely no sense to me in most regards, because when I asked and I put on my PhD hat here and I'll say, can you tell me how many cops who have gotten hired with bad credit have went and stole from somebody? And when nobody can tell me an answer, I say, okay, well, why are we doing that? Well, it's because we've always done it. The three deaf words to me, right? The other piece is family associations. One thing, in the background of the process is, people like to remove people from the process based on their family associations. And that, to me, were just two hurdles that we had to overcome. Now, what needed to be added and what, we've done that was really good was institute a character-based hiring process, not only hiring, but in promotion. And that resulted in, for me, when I was the undersheriff, we took the jail and made it the first majority jail in the state of Minnesota. We promoted more women, more people of color, hired more women, more people of color than anybody by using this character-based model. And really, essentially what it was like, go back to the question about, do you volunteer? We started looking at people's character, because I can train anybody to do anything, right? I mean, basically, if you can, we can teach you to shoot, teach you handcuff, we can do all that, but I can't teach good character. Either you have it or you don't. Right? And that's one of the things that really, in terms of the hiring piece. And the other thing that I think is, in terms of hiring for me was, and if you get a chance, you can Google Ramsey County Women's Academy. When we first started it, what we did was we took a group of women, we actively went out and recruited them, barbershops, beauty shops, grocery stores, community organizations. We say, hey, you ain't never thought about law enforcement? That's fine. Come here, volunteer time for a week. We're going to do this women's academy, where you do all this community service. You get to learn about every aspect of the sheriff's office at the time. And these were women who hadn't been to school to be cops, had never thought anything about law enforcement. And I can tell you, I hired so many after that to work in the jail, which was a good stepping stone to being law enforcement. And simply because we went out and asked Black women and women of color and women in general to come look and see what we had under the hood. So asking people is something that I think is the new model. It's not just turn on the light and say we're hiring sign. That's just not going to work for communities of color.
Okay. And Mariah completely flagged. in your experience, does hiring more Black officers have a significant impact on decreasing police brutality and just issues with law enforcement in communities of color?
Yes. The caveat, though, if people are integrated and not assimilated. And that's why when you hire, especially when you're diversifying a department, you can't just hire one or two. You got to try and hire as many people as possible. And what happens is, when people get into these departments and the department starts to diversify, you break down that unconscious bias that people have against people who are different than them. So yes, it does work if they're integrated and not assimilated. And that'd be a whole topic for a whole nother show.
For a whole nother video podcast episode. And I'm gonna get into my last question. I really want Domino to take this one first, but you both have really increased in the ranks and done a lot to expand your career past just, that entry-level cop, of course. So I think a good question to leave off is, do you believe Black officers have a heightened level of responsibility for addressing racism and implicit bias in policing? And does that responsibility grow as you increase in rank?
For me, I feel like it's, it's willing. It doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't matter what position you sit in or what rank you hold. It all comes back down to your character, who you are, what you believe in, and the ability to have those conversations or ability to, if you feel or see something that doesn't feel right or seem right or sound right, then you have to have the wherewithal to say something. And so I don't think it matters what position you sit in, what rank you hold.
Do you think it matters what race you ascribe to? Like, I think going back into, if you're a Black officer, I really need you to speak up for other Black officers and for Black communities and Black people when you see and hear and feel and experience things that are counterproductive to treating everybody equally and promoting a safe and just and humane society.
So I will say this too, that it's my job to speak up for anybody that I think is being treated unfairly or unequitably. And it doesn't necessarily matter, what they look like, because that's my character. But I think it's important, like I said, to have those conversations and to be able to point things out, and let people know if it affected you or if it didn't affect you, or how it can affect, the response to the community or other people within the organization.
Okay, thank you. And Booker, especially when you talk about, not assimilating, but integrating, and that requires, being pretty intensive about your identity and what you're going to keep intact, but also how do you defend and how do you take in that level of responsibility for addressing things that look like assimilation? Because we can always say assimilation is kind of a byproduct of racism and racist systems. So what's your take on the question?
So for me, and again, I just individualize it for me, being a little older, and running NAACP, I've completely, and I know this doesn't fit the narrative again, I've completely given up on other people feeling like they have to have an obligation to help people who look like them, right? Now, me personally, I don't hold that view, right? Like me personally, in my position, is higher I've risen up. I've been the same person from when I got hired day one to I am now. I've done everything that I've humanly possibly could to make sure that we've gotten more people who are African-American, Latino, Asian in the profession of law enforcement. Because for me, like when I get promoted, I'm the first X, right? Okay, who's going to be number two, right? Is this going to continue or is it this end with me, right? And I mean, again, I've gotten past expecting other people to do that. I think it's something that it's an individual basis, like I choose to advocate for some of that stuff. I know where others advocate for other things, but I mean, that's just how I choose to advocate. But as hard as I am on police officers, I'm that same way with the community. I don't pull no punches. I mean, as you can probably tell a little bit, I just don't play. I don't play with the community either. I mean, it's just like, again, I am as middle comes.
I think that was like the first thing you said that exposed that you're older. I don't play with y'all. Oh my gosh. Thank y'all so much for y'all's answers. And just to address both of you, I really enjoy being here in the space with you guys. I enjoyed that you really stuck with your identities and stuck with your experiences, and you didn't compromise, and you answered from the heart and from everything that you put into your careers. And I just can't thank you enough for being here.